You are walking through Pompeii in the summer of AD 79. The streets are crowded. Sailors, merchants, laborers, and enslaved people move between painted houses. On one wall, someone has scratched an advertisement. A person named Eutychus is available for 2 asses. Roughly the price of 2 cheap cups of wine. Across the city stands a building now called the Lupanar. 5 small rooms line a corridor. Each contains a built-in bed. Erotic paintings hang above the doors. For once, history gives us almost everything. A person, a price, a physical place. But Pompeii is not where paid sex began. It is only where the evidence becomes impossible to ignore. So, when did humans first start paying for sex? The honest answer is that we do not know, and we probably never will. Sex is older than our species. Exchange is older than money. A person did not need coins to offer food, protection, ornaments, shelter, or livestock in return for sexual access. That could have happened 5,000 years ago. It could have happened 50,000 years ago. But a private agreement does not fossilize. A stone tool survives. A shell bead survives. A human bone survives. A promise disappears with the people who made it. So, the history of paid sex does not begin when the first exchange happened. It begins when societies became complicated enough to leave evidence behind. And here is the first important distinction. Paid sex, prostitution, and sexual slavery are not the same thing. One person might exchange sex for food once, another might do it repeatedly. An enslaved person might be sold to customers while receiving none of the payment. To the buyer, all three can look like a transaction. To the person being sold, they can mean negotiation, survival, coercion, or no choice at all. For most of prehistory, humans lived without writing, coins, or permanent cities filled with strangers. But they did not live without exchange. Hunter-gatherer societies could have gifts, debts, possessions, marriage exchanges, and unequal access to resources. Sex may sometimes have been exchanged inside those systems. We simply cannot identify the first case. Cities did not invent paid sex, but cities changed its scale. By about 3200 BC, Uruk in southern Mesopotamia had become one of the first true cities in human history. Thousands lived among workshops, storehouses, temples, canals, and crowded neighborhoods. Many of them did not know one another, and strangers changed the rules. In a small community, an exchange follows you tomorrow. A gift creates an obligation. In a city, 2 people can meet, exchange something, and disappear into the crowd. Cities created anonymity. They also created merchants, soldiers, servants, widows, debtors, enslaved people, and travelers. Some households controlled land, grain, workshops, and stored silver. Others controlled almost nothing. The body could become one more thing traded inside that unequal economy. At the same time, Mesopotamian administrators began pressing symbols into clay. They recorded grain, beer, animals, fields, workers, rations. Writing developed largely because growing institutions needed to count goods and labor. And eventually, the records began naming categories of women that modern scholars have connected with prostitution. One Sumerian term was written kr.kiad. Its Akkadian equivalent was harimtu. For generations, harimtu was translated simply as prostitute. But the evidence is more complicated. Some women called harimtu may have sold sex. Others were associated with taverns or sexual availability outside marriage. But the term could also describe a woman outside the authority of a husband or father. She might be unmarried, widowed, divorced, independent, or simply unattached to a recognized household. Ancient Mesopotamia did not organize women into modern job titles. The same person could serve drinks, depend on a patron, live independently, and sometimes exchange sex for support. So the earliest evidence is not a receipt. There is no surviving tablet that says one sexual encounter paid with 2 jars of beer. What survives is a label. Then there is Shamhat. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Shamhat is sent to meet Enkidu, a wild man living among animals. She has sex with him, then introduces him to bread, beer, clothing, speech, and life among humans. Because the poem calls her a harimtu, she has often been described as a prostitute. Sometimes she is called a temple prostitute, but Enkidu never pays her. The story gives no price, and it never clearly says that a temple employed her to sell sex. Shamhat connects sexuality with civilization and the edges of respectable society. She does not prove a commercial transaction, and she does not prove the existence of temple brothels. This matters because sacred prostitution is one of the most repeated stories about the ancient world. Women supposedly waited inside temples, had sex with strangers, and gave the payment to a fertility goddess. It is dramatic. It is memorable, and the evidence for a widespread institution like that is extremely weak. Mesopotamian religion used sexual imagery, and Inanna and Ishtar were connected with desire, fertility, warfare, and power. But religious sexuality is not automatically commercial sex. A hymn is not a payroll document. A priestess is not automatically a prostitute. Most modern specialists reject the claim that Mesopotamian temples commonly operated organized sacred prostitution. By the late 2nd millennium BC, however, the evidence becomes harder to dismiss. The Middle Assyrian laws contained detailed rules about veiling. Married women and some widows were expected to cover their heads in public. Enslaved women were forbidden from doing so. So were women described by a term usually translated in this law as prostitute. The punishment for wearing a veil could be brutal: 50 blows, clothing taken away, hot pitch poured over the head. And here's the important part. The state was not trying to eliminate prostitution. It was trying to make status visible. The veil marked which women belonged to protected households and which were denied that protection. By this point, paid sex was not merely a private act. It had become part of a social category the government wanted everyone to recognize. But coins still did not exist. The earliest known coinage appeared in Lydia, in western Anatolia, near the end of the 7th century BC. From there, coins spread through the Greek world and across the Mediterranean. Coins did not invent paid sex. They made the transaction easier, portable, standardized, anonymous. A sailor could arrive in a port carrying wealth in one hand. Sex could now be priced in the same units as wine, bread, lodging, and labor. By the Greek and Roman periods, commercial sex was visible throughout urban life. There were brothels, taverns, rented rooms, intermediaries, taxes, graffiti, and laws. But do not imagine one profession experienced in one way. Some elite courtesans gained wealth and influential clients. Some poorer people negotiated directly. Many others were enslaved. They could not leave an owner, control their customers, or keep the payment. A price proves that the buyer spent money. It does not prove that the person providing sex received it willingly. That is why Pompeii matters. When Mount Vesuvius buried the city in AD 79, it preserved the physical world behind the transaction. The lupanar had 5 cramped rooms with built-in beds. Prices recorded in Pompeii often ranged from 2 to 8 asses. A cheap cup of wine could cost 1. And at the house of the Veti, graffiti advertised Eutychus, identified in the official archaeological guide as enslaved, for 2 asses. A person, a price, a room. But if Eutychus was enslaved, Eutychus was not simply setting a fee. Someone was selling access to another human being. The customer saw a transaction. Eutychus lived the consequences. So, is prostitution really the world's oldest profession? Probably not. Hunting is older. Gathering is older. Toolmaking, childcare, food preparation, healing, and shelter building are all older. Calling every sexual exchange a profession forces a modern job category onto societies that did not organize work the way we do. The first exchange may be prehistoric. The first profession cannot be identified. What we can trace is the system that formed around it. Mesopotamia gives us some of the earliest written labels that may include women who sold sex. Assyrian law shows the state violently marking which women could claim respectability and protection. Greek and Roman cities give us clearer markets, buildings, prices, advertisements, and evidence of widespread enslavement. So, when did humans first start paying for sex? Almost certainly before written history, possibly long before cities. But the evidence only becomes visible when societies begin recording wealth, classifying people, regulating public identity, and deciding whose body belonged to whom. The first payment vanished. The system around it survived. The tablet, the law, the veil, the graffiti, the room with the stone bed. We cannot identify the first buyer. We cannot identify the first person who was paid. We cannot know whether that first exchange involved desire, hunger, obligation, negotiation, or force. But we can see when governments began deciding which people were protected, which were available, and whose consent mattered. And that is the real history of paid sex. Not just the history of desire, the history of cities, the history of money, the history of slavery, the history of inequality, and the moment human societies learned not only to exchange access to the body, but to classify, control, and profit from the person inside it.